I pulled into my driveway after a 14-hour shift at the manufacturing plant in Columbus, Ohio. My muscles aching and my mind foggy with exhaustion, only to find my emergency evacuation signs missing from the fence line where I had carefully installed them just 3 days ago. My name is Carter Owens, and I work as a safety coordinator at a chemical processing facility, which meant I knew exactly how critical proper emergency signage was, especially in a residential area like Riverside Meadows, where houses sat close together, and quick evacuation could mean the difference between life and death. The signs had been bright red with reflective lettering, clearly marking the emergency assembly point at the corner of Maple Street and Birch Lane, about 200 feet from my property. I had installed them after our neighborhood experienced a gas leak scare 2 months earlier, when construction workers accidentally hit a main line. The chaos that ensued, with neighbors running in different directions and no clear meeting point, had convinced me we needed better emergency preparedness. I had even consulted with the local fire department before installing them, and Fire Marshal Rodriguez had personally approved their placement and design. Now they were gone, and in their place was a neon orange violation notice from the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, signed by none other than Patricia Cunningham, the HOA president, whose reputation for petty tyranny was legendary throughout the subdivision. The notice cited violation of Section 14.7 of the HOA bylaws, which apparently prohibited any signage not explicitly approved by the Architectural Review Committee. The fine was $250, with an additional $50 per day if I did not remove the offending signs within 72 hours. The irony that they had already removed the signs themselves was not lost on me. I crumpled the notice in my fist and walked around my property, checking for the other signs I had installed. The directional arrow signs pointing toward the assembly point were also missing, as were the smaller markers I had placed near the back gate. Every single one of them gone. I had spent over $300 on those signs, not to mention the time and effort to install them properly with concrete footings so they would withstand Ohio weather. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my neighbor, Frank Morrison, a retired firefighter who lived 2 houses down. "Carter, you see what those HOA vultures did to your emergency signs?" "Just got home and found them gone," I replied, feeling my blood pressure rising. "Did you see who took them?" "Patricia herself, along with that weasel Todd from the compliance committee. They had a pickup truck and were loading them up around noon. I tried to tell them those signs were there for safety reasons, but Patricia said something about maintaining neighborhood aesthetics and property values. I told her property values would not matter much if people died in an emergency because they did not know where to go. I thanked Frank and immediately pulled up Fire Marshal Rodriguez's number. We had worked together on several community safety initiatives over the past year, and he had been enthusiastic about my emergency signage project. He answered on the second ring. "Marshal Rodriguez, this is Carter Owens from Riverside Meadows. We met about the emergency assembly point signs." "Carter, yes, I remember. How is that project going?" "That is why I am calling. The HOA removed all the signs today and fined me for installing them without their permission. They cited some aesthetic bylaw." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Rodriguez spoke again, his voice had an edge to it. "They removed approved emergency evacuation signage. Did they not receive the letter I sent to the HOA board 2 weeks ago?" "What letter?" "After you consulted with me about the signs, I sent an official communication to the HOA board explaining that the signage was in compliance with local fire safety ordinances, and that the designated assembly point was approved by the fire department. I also mentioned that removing or interfering with approved emergency signage could result in violations of City Code Section 912. My heart started pounding faster. What does that code section cover? Interference with emergency preparedness measures. It is a pretty serious violation, Carter. Where are the signs now? I have no idea. My neighbor said they loaded them into a truck. Okay, here is what we are going to do. I am going to make some calls tomorrow morning. The HOA needs to understand they cannot just override fire safety measures because they do not like how something looks. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos of where the signs were, keep that violation notice they gave you, and write down exactly when you discovered them missing. I spent the next hour doing exactly that, photographing the empty post holes, the disturbed ground where the signs had been removed, and making detailed notes with timestamps. My wife, Rachel, came home while I was documenting everything, and her face darkened when I explained what had happened. Patricia Cunningham is unbelievable, Rachel said, shaking her head. Remember when she tried to fine the Hendersons for having their trash cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours? Or when she measured Janet's roses and claimed they extended 4 inches past the property line? This is different, though, I said. This is not about aesthetics or property lines. This is about safety. People could die if there is another emergency and no one knows where to gather. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and waited for Marshal Rodriguez to call. At 9:30, my phone rang. Carter, I have some interesting information for you. I pulled the permits for Riverside Meadows and discovered that several structures in the subdivision are not up to current fire code standards. The community clubhouse, for instance, has not had its fire suppression system inspected in over 3 years. That is a mandatory annual inspection. The pool house is missing required emergency exit signage. And the main entrance gate system does not have the proper emergency access override that allows fire trucks to enter without delay. Are you serious? Very serious. I am heading over to Riverside Meadows right now to conduct an inspection. Would you be available to meet me at the HOA office in about an hour? I agreed immediately and changed into clean clothes. The HOA office was located in the clubhouse, a sprawling building at the center of the subdivision that hosted community events and board meetings. I arrived 15 minutes early and waited in my truck, watching as Marshal Rodriguez pulled up in his official vehicle, followed by another fire department inspector. Patricia Cunningham's silver Lexus was already in the parking lot. Through the clubhouse windows, I could see her moving around inside, probably preparing for whatever HOA business she conducted on a daily basis. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of expensive athletic, where that suggested she spent more time at the country club than the gym. Rodriguez approached my truck and motioned for me to join him. Let me do the talking initially. I want to see how they respond. We entered the clubhouse together, and Patricia looked up from her desk with a practiced smile that faltered when she recognized me. Mr. Owens, if you are here to contest your violation, you need to submit a written appeal to the Architectural Review Committee. Mrs. Cunningham, I am Fire Marshal Rodriguez with the Columbus Fire Department. We spoke via email several weeks ago regarding emergency preparedness measures in Riverside Meadows. Her expression shifted to confusion. I do not recall any email. Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and showed her the screen. I sent this communication to the official HOA email address on file with the city on January 31st. It detailed the approved emergency signage that Mr. Owens was installing and explained that such signage is protected under city fire safety ordinances. Patricia barely glanced at the screen. I receive hundreds of emails. I cannot be expected to read every single one. Regardless, Mr. Owens violated our community bylaws by installing signage without approval. Our neighborhood has standards. Your neighborhood also has legal obligations regarding fire safety, Rodriguez replied, his tone hardening. I am here to conduct an inspection of HOA-maintained structures. I have reason to believe several violations of fire code exist on these premises. You cannot just show up and demand to inspect our property without notice. Rodriguez pulled out another document. This is a notice of inspection, properly filed with the city this morning. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 3737.22, fire marshals are authorized to conduct inspections of public and semi-public buildings, which includes HOA clubhouses and common areas. You can either allow us access, or I can return with law enforcement and a more formal order. Patricia's face flushed red. This is harassment. You are only doing this because of him. She pointed at me accusingly. I am doing this because I received a report that approved emergency signage was removed from this subdivision, which prompted me to review the overall fire safety compliance of the community. Now, shall we begin the inspection? For the next 2 hours, I watched as Rodriguez and his colleague went through the clubhouse with methodical precision. They documented the expired fire extinguishers, the fire suppression system that had not been serviced since 2022, the blocked emergency exit in the storage room, the missing evacuation plan posted near exits, and at least a dozen other violations. Patricia followed them around, growing more agitated by the minute. These are minor issues, she kept saying. We have been meaning to address them. Minor issues become major tragedies, Rodriguez replied. This fire suppression system protects a building that regularly hosts events with over 100 people. The fact that it has not been inspected or serviced in 3 years is negligent at best. They moved outside to inspect the pool area, and that was where things got worse for Patricia. The pool house was missing required emergency lighting. The chemical storage area for pool maintenance was not properly ventilated or labeled, and the fence gates did not have the required panic hardware that allowed them to open from the inside without a key. If there was a fire or emergency while people were using this pool, they could become trapped, Rodriguez explained, testing one of the locked gates. These gates need to be operable from the inside at all times during operating hours. By the time the inspection concluded, Rodriguez had documented over 30 violations. He printed out a comprehensive report and handed it to Patricia, whose hands were shaking. You have 30 days to address these violations. Failure to do so will result in the immediate closure of the clubhouse and pool facilities until compliance is achieved. Additionally, I am issuing a stop-use order for the clubhouse effective immediately until the fire suppression system is inspected and certified by a licensed contractor. You cannot close our clubhouse, Patricia shrieked. We have events scheduled. We have the spring gala next month. Then I suggest you contact a fire suppression company today. I have also noted in my report that approved emergency signage was removed from the subdivision. Those signs need to be returned and reinstalled within 72 hours, or the HOA will face additional fines from the city. We do not have his signs anymore, Patricia snapped. We disposed of them. Rodriguez and I both stared at her. You disposed of them? I asked. Those signs cost me over $300. They were eyesores that violated our bylaws. We had every right to remove them. Rodriguez shook his head slowly. Mrs. Cunningham, you just admitted to destroying property that was installed in compliance with fire safety ordinances. That is not just an HOA matter anymore. That is destruction of safety equipment which carries potential criminal penalties. Patricia's face went from red to pale in an instant. Criminal penalties? Yes. I will be filing a report with the Columbus Police Department regarding the destruction of the signs. Whether they pursue charges is up to them, but I am obligated to report interference with fire safety measures. This is insane. They were just signs. They were emergency evacuation markers that could save lives. You do not get to decide that aesthetics are more important than safety. I watched Patricia deflate, her usual commanding presence crumbling. What do you want from me? I want those signs replaced immediately, at the HOA's expense. I want all of these fire code violations addressed within the timeline I have provided. And I want a written apology to Mr. Owens acknowledging that the HOA overstepped its authority. The board will never agree to that. Then the board can explain their decision to the city, to your insurance company, and to every homeowner in this subdivision when they find out that you closed the clubhouse because you were too stubborn to follow fire safety laws. Rodriguez handed her his card and turned to leave. I followed him out to the parking lot, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. Thank you, I said. I had no idea it would go this far. These HOA boards think they are little kingdoms, Rodriguez replied. They forget that laws exist above their bylaws. Make sure you file a police report about the destroyed signs. Even if they do not press charges, you want that documented for when you take them to small claims court for reimbursement. I followed his advice and drove directly to the police station. Officer Jennifer Martinez took my statement and reviewed the photos and documentation I had brought. She seemed genuinely concerned about the situation. HOA disputes can get messy, she said, but destruction of property is straightforward. We will follow up with Mrs. Cunningham and the HOA board. You mentioned the fire marshal is filing a report as well. Yes, he said he would document the interference with fire safety measures. Good. That gives us multiple angles to approach this. In the meantime, I would recommend documenting any further interactions with the HOA. If they retaliate against you in any way, that could constitute harassment. I left the police station feeling slightly better but still frustrated. My emergency signs were gone, and replacing them would cost money I had not budgeted for. When I got home, Rachel was waiting with news of her own. The neighborhood Facebook group is blowing up, she said, showing me her phone. Word got out about the fire marshal's inspection, and people are furious with Patricia. I scrolled through the comments. Frank Morrison had posted about witnessing the sign removal and the subsequent fire marshal visit. Other neighbors were chiming in with their own stories of HOA overreach. Janet Williams wrote about how Patricia had tried to force her to remove a vegetable garden because it was not aesthetically pleasing. Mike Thompson described being fined for parking his work van in his own driveway overnight. The post had over 80 comments and was growing by the minute. Then I saw a comment from Todd Bergman, the compliance committee member who had helped Patricia remove my signs. Everyone needs to calm down. The HOA exists to protect property values. If we let people put up whatever signs they want, this neighborhood will look like a strip mall. Frank responded immediately. We are talking about emergency evacuation signs approved by the fire department, you moron. Not advertising. The thread devolved into arguments after that, with some people defending the HOA's right to maintain standards and others calling for Patricia's resignation. I stayed out of it, not wanting to inflame the situation further, but Rachel was less restrained. "These people are unbelievable," she said, typing furiously on her phone. "They care more about how the neighborhood looks than whether people are safe." That evening, I received an email from the HOA attorney, a man named Lawrence Bennett from a firm in downtown Columbus. The email was professionally worded but clearly threatening, suggesting that I had acted in bad faith by installing signs without proper approval, and that my actions had resulted in unwarranted harassment of HOA officials. It demanded that I cease all communications about the incident on social media and retract any statements I had made to authorities. I forwarded the email to Marshal Rodriguez and called him immediately. "This is pretty standard intimidation tactics," he said after reading it. "They are trying to scare you into backing down. Do not respond to this email. If they want to push this further, let them do it officially. In the meantime, I have already filed my report with the city, and the violations stand regardless of what their attorney says. Should I get a lawyer?" Might not be a bad idea, just to have someone in your corner if this escalates. But honestly, the HOA is in a much worse position than you are. They have multiple fire code violations, they destroyed approved safety equipment, and they are now facing potential fines from the city. Their attorney is probably telling them to settle this quietly. Over the next few days, the situation intensified. The Columbus Dispatch ran a story about HOA overreach in suburban communities, using my case as a prime example. A reporter named Sarah Mitchell had somehow gotten wind of the fire marshal's inspection and reached out to me for comment. I kept my statement brief and factual, but the article painted the HOA in a harsh light, noting that the clubhouse remained closed due to fire safety violations. Patricia called an emergency HOA board meeting, which homeowners were technically allowed to attend. Rachel and I showed up along with at least 50 other residents, filling the small conference room in the closed clubhouse to capacity. Patricia sat at the head table with 4 other board members, all looking uncomfortable under the weight of so many angry stares. "This meeting is to address recent events and misconceptions circulating in our community," Patricia began, her voice tight with stress. "The board has always prioritized the safety and well-being of our residents." "Then, why did you remove approved emergency signs?" Frank shouted from the back. "The signs were not properly submitted through the architectural review process," Patricia replied. "We have procedures for a reason." "The fire marshal approved them," another voice called out. "The fire marshal does not have authority over HOA bylaws," Todd Bergman interjected. "We have to maintain our standards." That set off a wave of angry responses. People were shouting over each other, and Patricia had to bang a gavel repeatedly to restore order. "The board has consulted with our attorney," she continued once the room quieted down. "We are reviewing our policies regarding emergency signage and will present revised guidelines at next month's meeting." "What about the clubhouse violations?" someone asked. "Are you going to fix those?" The fire marshal's inspection revealed some maintenance items that need to be addressed. "We are obtaining quotes from contractors and will have everything resolved within the required timeline." "Maintenance items." Frank stood up, his voice booming. "I am a retired firefighter. I have seen that violation report. You have over 30 serious code violations. The fire suppression system has not been serviced in 3 years. Do you understand how dangerous that is?" Patricia's jaw clenched. "We have limited funds and must prioritize expenditures. The previous board did not maintain proper inspection schedules. You have been president for 4 years." Someone else shouted. "You cannot blame the previous board." The meeting continued in chaos for another hour, with homeowners demanding accountability and the board deflecting responsibility. Finally, a woman named Helen Porter stood up. She was in her 70s, a longtime resident who commanded respect in the community. "I move that we hold a special election to recall the current board," she announced clearly. "They have demonstrated incompetence and poor judgment. We need leadership that prioritizes safety over aesthetics." The room erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Patricia tried to argue that the bylaws did not allow for midterm recalls, but Helen came prepared with a copy of the HOA governing documents, showing that a petition signed by 30% of homeowners could trigger a recall election. "I will be collecting signatures after this meeting," Helen announced. "Anyone interested in real change should see me outside." Rachel and I were among the first to sign. By the end of the evening, Helen had over 100 signatures, well above the threshold needed. The following week brought more developments. The fire suppression company's quote to repair and certify the clubhouse system came in at $18,000. The pool repairs, emergency lighting, and other violations would cost an additional $12,000. The HOA's reserve fund only had $15,000, meaning they would need to levy a special assessment on all homeowners or take out a loan. Patricia tried to blame me for the costs, sending out an email to all residents claiming that my unauthorized signage had triggered an unnecessary inspection that was now costing the community $30,000. The email backfired spectacularly. Residents who had been on the fence about the recall election now signed Helen's petition. The neighborhood Facebook group turned overwhelmingly against the board. Marshal Rodriguez called me with an update. "The HOA missed the deadline to return your signs. I have filed a formal violation with the city. They are now facing a $1,000 fine from the municipal court with additional daily penalties until the signs are replaced." How much are the daily penalties? $100 per day. That should motivate them pretty quickly. It did. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from Lawrence Bennett, the HOA attorney, offering to settle the matter. The HOA would reimburse me $350 for the destroyed signs, drop the original violation fine they had issued me, and issue a written statement acknowledging that emergency signage approved by the fire department was permitted in the subdivision. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue further legal action against the HOA. I called Rodriguez to get his opinion. "Take the settlement," he advised. "You get your money back, you get the signs replaced, and you get the policy changed. That is a win. The city's violations against the HOA will proceed regardless of your settlement, so they are still on the hook for the fire code issues." I agreed to the settlement terms, and within a week, I had a check and a written apology from the HOA. I used the money to order new signs, this time making sure to keep all the receipts and documentation. When they arrived, Frank helped me install them, and several neighbors came out to watch and express their support. "It should not have taken all this," Frank said as we mixed concrete for the post footings. "But at least Patricia got knocked down a few pegs." The recall election happened 3 weeks later. Patricia and 3 other board members were removed by overwhelming margins. Helen Porter was elected president, along with 4 other residents who campaigned on transparency and common sense. Their first official act was to conduct a comprehensive review of all HOA bylaws and remove provisions that conflicted with city ordinances or common safety practices. The clubhouse finally reopened in late April after passing reinspection from the fire marshal. The repairs had required a special assessment of $200 per household, which many residents paid grudgingly, but understood was necessary. Patricia tried to attend the reopening celebration, but left quickly after receiving cold stares from most attendees. In May, I received a call from Sarah Mitchell, the reporter from the Columbus Dispatch. "Carter, I wanted to follow up on your story. The City Council is considering a new ordinance that would specifically protect homeowners who install fire safety measures approved by the fire department. Your case basically inspired it." "That is great news," I said. "No one else should have to go through what I went through." "Would you be willing to testify at the City Council meeting when they vote on it?" I agreed, and 3 weeks later, I sat in City Hall and told my story to the assembled council members. Marshal Rodriguez also testified, explaining how HOA overreach often interfered with fire safety measures. The ordinance passed unanimously, establishing clear protections for approved safety equipment and imposing penalties on HOAs that interfered with such measures. The local news covered the vote, and suddenly, I was getting calls from other HOA residents across Columbus dealing with similar issues. One man had been fined for keeping a fire extinguisher visible on his porch. Another family was threatened with violation notices for installing security cameras that the HOA claimed were unsightly. I referred them all to the new ordinance and to Marshal Rodriguez. Patricia Cunningham quietly moved out of Riverside Meadows in June. The rumor was that she and her husband bought a house in a non-HOA neighborhood, which struck many people as ironic. Todd Bergman remained in the subdivision, but kept an extremely low profile after Helen's new board removed him from the compliance committee. In August, the city sent a letter informing the former HOA board that they were being fined $5,000 for the fire code violations that had existed under their watch. The letter cited willful neglect of safety standards. Patricia tried to argue that the fine should be paid from HOA funds, but Helen's board refused, correctly pointing out that the negligence was the responsibility of the previous board members personally. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia was considering bankruptcy to avoid paying her share of the fine. I felt a twinge of sympathy, but mostly remembered the stress and expense she had put me through over signs that could save lives. Life in Riverside Meadows improved dramatically under Helen's leadership. The new board conducted a comprehensive safety audit of the entire subdivision, installing additional emergency signage at key locations and establishing a neighborhood emergency response team. Frank led training sessions on evacuation procedures and basic fire safety. We even held a community drill one Saturday morning, which revealed several areas for improvement, but overall demonstrated that people now knew where to go and what to do in an emergency. Rachel and I hosted a backyard barbecue in September to thank everyone who had supported us during the conflict. Frank brought his famous ribs, Helen made her signature potato salad, and nearly 30 neighbors showed up to celebrate. As I stood by the grill, watching people laugh and talk, I felt genuinely grateful for how things had turned out. "You started something good here," Helen said, appearing at my elbow with a plate of food. "This community needed a wake-up call." "I just wanted to put up some signs," I replied with a laugh. "And you ended up reforming an entire HOA. That is not nothing, Carter." Marshal Rodriguez stopped by the barbecue, off-duty and clearly enjoying himself. "This is what neighborhoods should look like," he said. "People actually caring about each other instead of just property values." "Have you dealt with any other HOA issues since our situation?" I asked. "A few, but nothing as dramatic. Word got around about what happened here. Most HOA boards are being much more cautious about interfering with safety measures now. Your case basically became the cautionary tale." The new city ordinance was officially named the Residential Fire Safety Protection Act, though some people jokingly called it the Owens Amendment. It established clear guidelines for HOAs regarding safety equipment, required HOA boards to consult with fire officials before removing any safety signage, and created a streamlined appeal process for homeowners facing violations related to approved safety measures. By October, life had returned to normal, or at least a new normal where people actually paid attention to emergency preparedness. The signs I had installed still stood proudly at the designated assembly points, their reflective letters catching the light. Every time I drove past them, I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing they were there, approved, protected, and ready to serve their purpose if ever needed. Frank and I became good friends through the whole ordeal. We started meeting for coffee every Saturday morning at a local diner, swapping stories and catching up on neighborhood news. He told me stories from his firefighting days, emphasizing again and again how important proper emergency planning was. I have seen too many situations go bad because people panicked and did not know where to go, he said one morning over scrambled eggs. Those signs you fought for could genuinely save lives someday. Never forget that. I ran into Todd Bergman at the grocery store in November. He looked uncomfortable when he spotted me but managed a weak nod. I nodded back and kept walking. There was no point in holding grudges, though I certainly had not forgotten his role in removing my signs. Patricia's bankruptcy filing became public record in December. She had tried to fight the city's fine but lost in court. The judge ruled that, as HOA president, she bore personal responsibility for the willful neglect of fire safety standards. The ruling set a precedent that HOA board members could be held personally liable for safety violations, not just the association itself. The Riverside Meadows HOA newsletter, now professionally written and actually informative under Helen's leadership, ran a detailed article about the importance of fire safety and the improvements made over the past year. It included photos of the new emergency signage, information about the neighborhood response team, and a schedule of upcoming safety training sessions. My name was mentioned prominently, which was slightly embarrassing but also validating. Christmas brought snow to Columbus, and Riverside Meadows looked picturesque with lights and decorations on nearly every house. The HOA's revised guidelines allowed for reasonable holiday displays without the nitpicky restrictions that Patricia had enforced. People went all out and the neighborhood actually felt festive and welcoming. Rachel and I hosted a New Year's Eve party, and as midnight approached, I found myself on the back deck with Frank, watching fireworks in the distance. "Hell of a year," Frank said, raising his beer. "Hell of a year," I agreed, clinking my bottle against his. "You ever think about running for the HOA board?" I laughed. "No way. Helen is doing a great job. I am happy to just live here peacefully." "Fair enough. But if you change your mind, you would have a lot of support." As January rolled around and the new year began, I reflected on everything that had happened. What started as a simple desire to improve neighborhood safety had become a months-long battle involving the fire department, police, city council, and eventually the court system. It had been exhausting and stressful, but ultimately worth it. The emergency signs stood as permanent reminders that safety should never be compromised for aesthetics. The new city ordinance protected other homeowners from similar overreach. The HOA had been reformed from the inside out. And Patricia Cunningham had learned, albeit the hard way, that there were limits to HOA authority. I still worked long shifts at the manufacturing plant, still came home exhausted most nights, but now I drove past those emergency signs with pride. They represented more than just evacuation markers. They represented standing up for what was right, even when facing intimidation and threats. They represented community members coming together to demand better leadership. They represented the principle that safety matters more than appearances. Marshal Rodriguez called me in February with news that made me smile. "Carter, I wanted you to know that we are using the Riverside Meadows case as a training example for our community outreach program. When we talk to neighborhood groups and HOAs now, we specifically discuss your situation and how it should have been handled differently. I am glad something positive came from all that stress. More than positive. You genuinely changed how HOAs and fire departments interact in this city. That is a real legacy." Spring arrived, and with it came the rebirth of gardens and lawns across Riverside Meadows. Janet Williams's vegetable garden, which Patricia had tried to ban, flourished with tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. She shared her harvest generously with neighbors, and several other residents started their own vegetable patches. The neighborhood felt more alive, more connected, less constrained by arbitrary rules. The spring gala, the event Patricia had worried about missing due to the clubhouse closure, happened in April and was the best attended in years. Helen's board had transformed it from a stuffy, formal affair into a genuine community celebration with food trucks, live music, and activities for kids. I watched families enjoying themselves and thought about how much had changed. Mike Thompson, the neighbor who had been fined for parking his work van in his driveway, approached me during the gala. "I never got to properly thank you," he said. "After you fought the HOA and won, I challenged my violation too. Helen's new board reviewed it and agreed the old rule was ridiculous. Now I can park my van at home like a normal person." Stories like Mike's reinforced why the fight had been worth it. The ripple effects extended far beyond my emergency signs to touch dozens of families dealing with unreasonable restrictions. In May, Sarah Mitchell from the Columbus Dispatch called again. "Carter, I am doing a 1-year follow-up article on your case. How have things been?" We talked for nearly an hour. I told her about the improved community atmosphere, the safety training programs, the reformed HOA board, and the city ordinance that continued to protect homeowners. She asked about Patricia, and I honestly said I had not seen or heard from her since she moved away. "Do you have any regrets about how things went down?" Sarah asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I regret that it had to get so contentious. I wish Patricia and the old board had just listened to reason from the start, but I do not regret fighting for what was right. Those signs needed to be there, and now they are, along with better protections for everyone." The article ran in early June with the headline, "How One Homeowner's Fight for Safety Reformed an HOA." It included updated photos of the neighborhood, interviews with Helen and Marshal Rodriguez, and a sidebar explaining the new city ordinance. The article was shared widely on social media and picked up by several national news outlets covering HOA reform movements. I received emails from people across the country dealing with similar issues. A woman in Texas was fighting her HOA over solar panels. A man in Florida was battling restrictions on hurricane shutters. A couple in Arizona faced violations for xeriscaping their lawn to conserve water. I replied to as many as I could, offering advice and encouragement based on my experience. "You have become an accidental activist," Rachel teased one evening as I typed responses to yet another batch of emails. "I just want to help people not go through what we went through," I said. These HOA boards need to understand they are not above the law. In July, I was invited to speak at a state conference on HOA governance reform. Legislators, city officials, and homeowner advocates gathered in Cleveland to discuss potential statewide regulations on HOA authority. My presentation focused on the need for clear protections regarding safety measures and the importance of accountability for board members. The conference led to discussions about statewide legislation modeled after Columbus's ordinance. Several representatives expressed interest in sponsoring a bill. By the end of the day, I had business cards from a dozen officials and advocates who wanted to stay in touch as the legislative process moved forward. Frank found the whole thing hilarious. "You went from installing signs to influencing state law. That is quite a journey." "It feels surreal," I admitted. "I am just a guy who works at a manufacturing plant. I am not a lawyer or activist." "You are exactly what this movement needs," Frank replied. "You are a regular person who stood up to bullies and won. That resonates with people." August brought cooler evenings and the start of back-to-school preparations. The neighborhood kids returned to classes, and Riverside Meadows settled into its usual rhythms. The emergency signs, now nearly a year old, still looked fresh and clear. We had not needed them for an actual emergency yet, thank goodness, but everyone knew they were there. Helen's board continued making improvements. They established a community garden in an underutilized common area, organized monthly neighborhood cleanups, and created a welcome committee for new residents. The HOA newsletter featured spotlights on longtime neighbors and tips for maintaining homes without onerous restrictions. In September, I received notice that Patricia's bankruptcy case had been settled. She had paid a portion of the fine through a payment plan, and the rest had been forgiven due to her financial situation. I felt neither satisfaction nor anger at the news, just a sense of closure. She had faced consequences for her actions, and the system had worked, more or less. The Neighborhood Emergency Response Team, which now had over 20 trained members, conducted its second annual drill. This time, participation was even higher, with families treating it as a serious exercise rather than an annoyance. Frank timed the evacuation and declared us significantly improved from the previous year. "If we ever have a real emergency, people will know exactly what to do," he announced at the team meeting afterward. "That is because of those signs and the training we have done. You all should be proud." October brought the anniversary of that day when I discovered my signs missing. A full year had passed, and the transformation was remarkable. I drove home from work that afternoon taking the same route, past the same signs that had caused so much controversy, and felt a deep sense of peace. Rachel had made my favorite dinner to mark the occasion. "Happy anniversary of the great HOA battle," she said with a smile. "Let us hope we never have another one," I replied. "Agreed. But if we do, at least we know how to fight." In November, the Ohio State Legislature introduced House Bill 847, the Homeowner Safety Protection Act. The bill, directly inspired by my case, would establish statewide standards preventing HOAs from interfering with fire safety measures, security systems, and other protective equipment approved by relevant authorities. Several news outlets covered the bill's introduction, and my phone rang with interview requests. I testified before the State House Committee in December, once again telling my story, but this time to an audience with the power to create lasting change across Ohio. The committee members asked thoughtful questions about balancing HOA authority with homeowner rights. I emphasized that reasonable restrictions were fine, but safety should always take precedence. "No one should have to fight like I did just to protect their neighborhood," I said. Clear state standards would prevent these conflicts before they start. The bill passed the committee unanimously and moved to the full House for consideration. Political observers predicted it would pass easily given the bipartisan support for HOA reform. Christmas in Riverside Meadows felt joyful and unified. The neighborhood looked beautiful with coordinated but not mandated decorations. Helen's board had struck the right balance between maintaining standards and allowing personal expression. People actually seemed to enjoy living here now, rather than constantly worrying about violation notices. At our annual New Year's Eve party, now a neighborhood tradition, Frank raised his glass for a toast. To Carter, who reminded us all that doing the right thing matters more than keeping the peace, and to everyone here who stood with him when it counted. To Carter, the room echoed. I felt my face flush with embarrassment but also gratitude. To all of you, I replied. A neighborhood is only as good as the people who live there. We proved we have pretty good people. As the new year began, House Bill 847 continued its progress through the legislature. By February, it had passed both the House and Senate and awaited the governor's signature. Marshal Rodriguez called to congratulate me on the impending victory. "This started with you refusing to back down over some signs," he said. "Now we are about to have statewide protections that will help thousands of homeowners. That is something to be proud of." The governor signed the bill in March with a public ceremony. I attended along with Helen, Frank, and several other Riverside Meadows residents. The governor mentioned my case specifically in his remarks, noting how one person standing up for safety had catalyzed meaningful reform. "Too often, homeowners associations lose sight of their purpose," the governor said. "They exist to maintain and improve communities, not to override common sense or safety. This law ensures that the protection of residents will always take priority over aesthetics." The signing made national news, and suddenly, I was fielding calls from HOA reform advocates across the country. States like California, Florida, and Texas were considering similar legislation. I became an informal consultant to these efforts, sharing my experience and encouraging others to push for change. "You have definitely become an activist now," Rachel said as I prepared for yet another video call with legislators in Arizona. "I guess I have," I admitted. "But it is for a good cause." Spring returned to Columbus, completing the full cycle. 2 years had passed since I first installed those emergency signs. The signs themselves had weathered through 2 Ohio winters and still stood strong, a testament to proper installation and quality materials. More importantly, they represented a change in mindset, not just in Riverside Meadows but across the state and potentially the nation. I still worked at the manufacturing plant, still focused on safety in my professional life. But now, I also spent time helping others navigate HOA conflicts, testifying at legislative hearings and speaking at conferences. It was exhausting but fulfilling work. Frank and I maintained our Saturday morning coffee tradition. We talked about everything from sports to politics to neighborhood gossip. Our friendship, forged in the fire of the HOA battle, had become one of the unexpected gifts of the whole experience. "You ever think about writing a book?" Frank asked one morning. "About what?" "Your story." "The whole HOA fight, the reforms, all of it. People would read that," I laughed. "I am not a writer. Besides, my story is not that special." "That is where you are wrong. Your story is exactly the kind of thing people need to hear." Regular person stands up to authority, faces threats and intimidation, but keeps fighting and eventually wins. That is inspiring. Maybe Frank was right, but for now, I was content to live quietly and help others when I could. The emergency signs remained in place, the neighborhood thrived under sensible leadership, and the laws had changed for the better. That felt like enough. As I pulled into my driveway that evening after another long shift, I paused to look at the nearest emergency sign, its reflective surface catching the last rays of sunlight. It was just a sign, really red letters on a white background, nothing fancy or elaborate. But it represented something larger, a principle that safety and common sense should prevail over arbitrary rules. I walked inside to find Rachel preparing dinner, the house warm and welcoming. Outside, children played in yards without fear of violation notices. Neighbors talked across fences without worrying about HOA spies. Riverside Meadows had become the kind of place Patricia Cunningham probably never imagined, a community where people actually wanted to live, not just a subdivision with perfect aesthetics and miserable residents. The emergency sign stood ready, protecting a neighborhood that had learned the hard way that safety matters. And if another HOA in another city tried to remove safety equipment tomorrow, well, they would find the fight much harder now. The laws had changed. The precedents had been set. And people like me, regular homeowners who simply refused to back down, had shown that change was possible. That was legacy enough for me.